Gracious God, may the words of my mouth, may the meditations of our hearts and our minds, even our spirits, may these all be acceptable in your sight. O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I would say that it is impossible to understand God. Who God is, how God acts in us and in our world without first understanding a little bit about physics and, of course, adhesive science as applied to epoxies. It's almost impossible. Now, you know and I know that's not really true. But it is very helpful to know a little bit about physics and the science of epoxies. And here's why. In physics, the second law of thermodynamics states this, that everything in a closed system, left to its own, over time, it tends towards chaos and disorder. It falls apart. Buildings, lawns, bodies, communities, relationships, left on their own, they tend to break down and decay. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Thank goodness, then, that we have epoxy. Because you know what epoxy does, right? Epoxy puts back together everything that's broken and is falling apart. And so we have this second law of thermodynamics, and we have epoxy, which binds up what has become undone. And it does so in quite a remarkable way, which I really do want to demonstrate to you. Notice I have two sticks. They're not together. They're suffering a little bit of that second law of thermodynamics. They are part of this. And you can see that this man is starting to fall apart. It does not have its arms. But thank goodness I have something over here. Let me make sure I have the right one. Yes, this is it. Yes, we need some glasses. So this is the third thing of our experiment. This, oh my. It's very thick. So let me take the top right off. So this, whoop, there it is. This, as you can see, is a goop. You can see it right there. It's kind of a viscous liquid. This is what is called a resin. This represents you and I. This within this cup. This will not get these two sticks to come together. This resin will never be able to bring these two sticks together. Thank goodness, as I've alluded to before, for epoxy. So that's what's in this little cup bottle. So let me put this in. Now I have more goop. And I'll mix that together. Because what happens, an epoxy, when it is mixed into a resin, into which that represents us, a chemical reaction starts to take place. The epoxy changes fundamentally the resin into something completely different. Completely different, with completely different capabilities and characteristics that were not present before. That is what an epoxy does. I'm just making sure that it's really happening. I've read the instructions. Let me stir this one too. I have a second one which I started a little bit ahead of time. Interestingly enough, while we're waiting for this to turn, an epoxy has two times according to it. One is a set time. That's when it starts to harden. And then when it finally does make all the changes that it is going to make in the resin, that is the time of curing. Isn't that interesting? Then epoxy, when it changes the resin, it's called a curing of the resin. So let's see if we have that moment. Let me put these two sticks together. And
it's not cured.
It's not cured. I just demonstrated the second law of thermodynamics. It is starting to fall apart. I'm going to set this aside just for a second. Just for a second. And let it do its work. You know and I know that we've tried to change, right? And it takes longer than a few seconds. It's no different with an epoxy. So we will let that start to change. But as it does, this is how God begins to work in our lives. That resin, with that epoxy now mixed in it, becomes something completely new. The old has passed away, and it is a new creation. Does that sound familiar? That sounds familiar because that's a piece of Scripture. That in Christ, the old passes away, and we become a new creation. Is it possible that God works in our lives? Christ works in our lives like epoxy. Hold that thought just for a second. And as the epoxy in this cup changes the resin, things become remarkably new. What was once impossible becomes possible. Now, I don't have time. We have a brunch waiting for us. But these, of course, would be the arms to the body. It would start to come back together again. And that is what an epoxy does. Here in this cup, it's what it does in our lives. But so often when things break down, in our lives, whether that be a community, a relationship, a marriage, the peace around us, justice, what we so often tend to do is to wait for or demand that those around us change. We believe that what we hope for, the peace, the justice, the community that we desire, depends on the people around us changing. And so we demand it. Or sometimes we wait for it. But I'm sure, perhaps you've noticed in your life, I have certainly noticed in mine, that I, and maybe you as well, cannot change another person. I cannot change another person. Now, I've tried that. I don't recommend it. Because the prospective changee and the changer both end up angry, resentful, and frustrated. That is how that goes. The only real way, then, if we want to have a change happen in this world, if we want to restore that which has started to deteriorate in this world, is by changing ourselves. But that is hard. Let me tell you how hard. According to Forbes magazine, why they did the survey, I do not know. But they have determined that only 8% of New Year's resolutions last 6 months. Not forever, only 6 months, and only 8% of the time. So let me ask you a question. If only 8% of us are successful at changing ourselves, when we are motivated to change, when we want to change, we recognize that change is necessary in our lives. Sometimes our health depends on the success of that change. We still only are successful 8% of the time. So how often do you think we are successful at changing others who don't want to change, who aren't motivated to change, that think that change is not in their best interest. I don't know what that number is. It's far less than 8. But there is good news. There is good news for our New Year's resolutions. There is good news for those dry bones in the valley that Ezekiel sees. There is good news for our hopes that live deep within our soul. Yes, we may not be able to change others. Yes, we may not even be all that successful in changing ourselves. But God can. God can change us. God's Spirit, inhaled into our very selves, has the power, like an epoxy, to change us, to bring us together, to restore life and a glorious life-lush dampness into the dryness of our bones. And that is what happens in our scripture in that valley. Now, I'm sure that that pile of bones in the valley once started off as vibrant bodies, lushly alive, but left on its own, we know physics, it started to deteriorate. The sense of community, that spirit among them began to dry up. The differences among them caused them to split. Pride, judgment, jealousies corroded the bonds that connected them. And it got each of those bones thinking, just like that eye in 1 Corinthians that said to the hand, I don't need you. And just like the head that said to the foot, I don't need you. All these bones saying to one another, I don't need you. Or so they thought. Until that body, lush with life, became devastatingly desiccated and fell completely apart. Then the Spirit of God poured out like an epoxy upon those bones and changed them fundamentally. Changed the atoms, the molecules, the very chemistry of those bones, allowing them to come back into relationship, back into community, back into a life of lushness. It was as if suddenly, with God's Spirit upon them, that they remembered that to be truly alive, they did, in fact, need one another. To lean on, to connect with, so that they could thrive. In fact, so that they could even just survive. And of course, we are the same. Though at times, we forget. We forget. But there is hope, because when God's epoxy-like Spirit poured onto them, or when it pours into us, it changes us. It makes of us a whole new creation, one which it is possible to offer a wider welcome. It's possible, with that change that the Spirit makes in us, to conceive of a greater compassion. God's Spirit mixed into our own softens judgments. It cures jealousies. It frees the fettered spirit of forgiveness within us. And that changes the world. That is how God works in us. Now that we've seen the physics of it and the epoxy science behind it, that is how God works in us and our world. Like an epoxy. Restoring community, bringing life abundant, heroically fighting against that second law of thermodynamics at every turn by changing us fundamentally into a new creation. One that makes possible that which before was not at all possible. Now, very often, we feel that we are insignificant in the scheme of things, that if we change, that won't change anything. We're too small, we're too insignificant, but that's not true. For when God changes me, God changes us. When God changes you, God changes us. In this little demonstration here, oh look, it's you. How nice. If only life worked that fast outside of this little demonstration. The only thing that changed was the resin. These two sticks, they didn't change at all. Yet, when the resin changed, when I change, what they become a part of, what they can do, what possibilities then exist for all three of us, changes. It's not dependent on them. It was only dependent on change of one of the three. And that's you. Your changing affects what's possible for everyone. And so this morning, if you want the world to change for the better, and who doesn't? If you want to restore within this world a life more lush, then let us begin by changing ourselves. Or more accurately, breathe in God's Spirit, God's breath, and let it begin to change us. And even though you cannot make another person change, you can inspire them to change themselves when they see the changes in you. This morning, may that change, the changes within us that affect the world, be the beginning of a revitalization revolution. Wherever in this world there are valleys and bones so dry. Amen.